Welcome, everyone, to the third edition of the seminar series on Sephardi modernities, co-sponsored by the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University and the Billsberg Program for Israel Studies at University of Calgary, and organized by Yuval Evri and myself, Angie Cohen. We are so happy to be doing this for a third year. When we started this project, our idea was to have a small seminar where friends and colleagues would share their ideas about the uncomfortable space of the Sephardi, Levantine, Judeo-Arab experience in the context of Jewish studies. 3 years later, we feel that this space has started to have an entity of its own, and the discussions and ideas that have been shared here now constitute the framework and parameters of the years to come. This year's seminar continues where we left things last year, the scholarly frameworks from which to approach the diversity of Sephardi experiences of modernization and the social, political, and cultural implications of such frameworks. Thus, the title of the edition, The Future of Our Histories, Recollecting the Past, Projecting the Future. Our starting point is the assumption that every description of the past of a collective involves a prescription, or to put it differently, our ways of looking at the past are mediated by our political, cultural, and moral commitments. This year, we want to explore the multiplicity of identities at play in the different Sephardi experiences of modernity, and try to draw a different map of Jewish belonging that calls for a reconceptualization of the separation between disciplines, as well as for a different approach to identity, history, and culture. Once again, we have invited our participants to articulate their ideas in dialogue with another researcher. Since this was conceived as a seminar where to learn with and from each other, dialogue continues to be the most conducive means to achieve ideas that are porous and open to discussion. The seminar will be structured as usual, 45 minutes of presentation and half an hour of Q&A. I will be moderating the chat, so you're all welcome to write your questions there. If someone wishes to open their microphone and ask a question, you're more than welcome to do so. Just make sure to let us know on the chat and wait for your turn. Our third edition is being inaugurated by Professor Ella Shohat in dialogue with Professor Yuval Evri. Before Yuval makes the formal introduction to our speaker, I just want to say what an honor it is to welcome you in our seminar. Your work has had such an enormous impact on those of us who came behind you, and you provided us with a language and a framework of reference with which we were able to build our projects. You provided us with analytical and conceptual tools to confront the often alienating narratives and discourses that were taken for granted in the academic spaces inhabited by those of us who researched Sephardic lives. So thank you very much for agreeing to be here with us. And now I will leave it to Yuval.
Thank you, Angie, for this introduction and for the fruitful collaboration and dialogue on this joint project. I'm thankful for our opportunity to work together. This is the third year and it's growing and we're learning a lot together. So thank you. I want to echo your words on Ella Shohat. It is really a great pleasure and immense honor to have Professor Shohat open the 2023 seminar series. In a way, many of the questions, concepts, and issues discussed in our seminars in the previous years were inspired by and in conversation with Shohat's vast and rich scholarship, which greatly influenced the current work in the field of the Sephardi and Mizrahi history, identity, and culture. And on a more personal note, Shohat's work had a massive impact on my academic journey and training. In our last conversation, Ella, yesterday, we just recalled that it was more than 20 years ago that we met first time, and since then we are in conversation. And I learned a lot, and I hope that this kind of today conversation is continuation of this kind of dialogue. For many Mizrahi students and scholars of my generation, her work opened a new theoretical and disciplinary horizon to think about the experience of the Mizrahi Sephardi Jews beyond the narrow nationalistic paradigm, which was focused for many years on the Mizrahi Ashkenazi internal ethnic divide, השסע העדתי, in Israel. She introduced new analytical tools to understand Sephardic cultural history in its fullness, complexity, transcending geographical, historical, and disciplinary boundaries. During our conversation today, we will explore and discuss some of these conceptual and methodological frameworks that Shohat developed in her work, such as diasporic readings, relational analysis, and transregional and cross-border readings. The starting point of our discussion will be Shohat's work on the Sephardi-Moorish Atlantic, and we will explore the way in which it provides a new epistemic frame and alternative starting point to the discussion on Sephardi modernity and the way discourse about Jews and Muslims in Iberia traveled into the Americas. But first, let's start with a brief biographical introduction. Professor Ella Shohat is a professor of cultural studies in New York University and has taught, lectured, and written extensively on issues relating to Eurocentrism and Orientalism, as well as with the post-colonial and transnational approaches to cultural studies. More specifically, since the early mid-1980s, she has developed critical approaches to studying Arab Jews, Mizrahim, Sephardim. Among her award-winning publications, this is really a short list, and because there's really a lot of writings and books and essays and articles that we all, of course, encourage you to engage and look for. I will only mention some of them. One of them is on the Arab Jew, Palestine, and other displacements, selected writings that was published in 2017. Taboo Memories, Diasporic Voices, that was published in 2006. And Israeli Cinema, East and West, and the Politics of Representation, that was firstly published in 1989, but they had a new and updated edition that was published in 2010. And lastly, I will mention Between the Middle East and the Americas, the Cultural Politics of Diaspora is a co-edited volume published in 2013. Her writing has been translated into many languages, including Arabic, Hebrew, Turkish, French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, Polish, and Italian. So you can already see that it will be really hard task to really cover all her work. During this academic year at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Studies in Michigan, Professor Shohat co-heads with Professor Ruth Sofar the fellow group focusing on the theme of Mizrahim and the politics of ethnicity. So now, after this long introduction and many beginnings to this conversation, I want Ella to start our conversation with the question of possible beginnings of the Sephardi and Mizrahi history. In the scholarly literature, there is a tendency to start Sephardi modernity or modern history with colonialism and nationalism, to either point to the alliance, the French influence that came to the Middle East, to this Sephardi community that sparked the modernity, or the national movement that brought this kind of new history and displacement or movement and migration of these communities from one place to another, or to emphasize the creation of the State of Israel and the creation of Mizrahim. So there is usually this kind of beginning starts this different kind of scholarly work. In your work, Ella, you offer something else, trying to challenge this kind of monolithical kind of beginning point. You offer a relational approach to this question with the multiple notions of temporalities and geographies. You are looking at multiple discursive and historical beginning points instead of adopting one singular temporal frame. One of these points of departure in your work is 1492, or as you reframed it, the two 1492s. You are recoupling the partition, the histories and memories of the two 1492's events, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain, from Iberia, and the conquest of the Americas. So maybe let's start with that. Can you say something about this formation?
Thank you, Angie, and thank you, Yuval. First of all, since we are about beginnings, I would like to begin with saying how immensely grateful I am for this invitation and how proud I am to be part of this series on Sephardic modernities, not only because it's about Sephardian modernities, but rather because it is of the epistemic framework, the kind of questions that you're trying to raise, and particularly within the context of Jewish studies, which for some of us, I have colleagues and friends here of my generation who have been struggling with our place, shall we say, or the place of our work, better to say, within the framework called Jewish studies, with all its baggage and its own intellectual history and thematic focus and methodologies. So in this regard, I'm happy to be part of this conversation, and also see, at least I recognize some faces once the Zoom was open, and so I'm truly honored to be here. So in terms of the question of beginnings, within post-structuralist theory in general, the question of beginning was always very important in contradistinction to the idea of origins, which, as we know, very much haunts the debate around Arab, Jew, Sephardi, Moor. And for us, I think for many of us who are critical of discourses of origins, it's beginnings was in some ways, and where do you place that point as a kind of a reflexive moment in which we become aware on the constructed nature of any question of origins. So I think that is crucial to understand why beginning and not something else. But beginning also has its own problems, as you already pointed out. What history, which beginning, which intellectual history, which beginning, and in which geography. That's the reason why we have in the subtitle the idea of the multi-chronotope, borrowing from Bakhtin, the idea of the chronotope, but sort of like in my essay, Rupture and Return, I started thinking about it as, the chronotope is important, but especially in terms of our history of displacement, dislocation, and this kind of palimpsestic movement. How do we conceptualize identity and think about those movements? Is it one point of origin? And where are we going with that? Where are we heading? But the notion of where do we begin in terms of intellectual history, the beginning of ideas, become really crucial here, because so let's take the concept of Orientalism, and why is it relevant to the Sephardic story, the Moorish story, and when does it begin to be relevant? As we know from the critical writing about the idea of when does Orientalism begin, whether in the work of Anwar Abdul Malik or Tibi or Edward Said, it is definitely begins with the moment of the Napoleonic conquest of arrival to Egypt, and later on, of course, with the French conquest of Algeria. So there is a very specific historical moment that attaches the ideology of Orientalism or the Orientalist imaginary to this actual arrival to the Middle East and North Africa. While this is a very important narrative, and I also was important to me to speak about it in another way. And I think this is really important because it's not about substituting one beginning with another. It's about thinking of multiple beginnings for particular formations of identities and discourses. One thing, and I'll tell you historically how it started really in terms of my own biography, was 1992 and the whole quincentenary celebrations, which I attended many, and myself also curated and organized a number of them. So the idea of the Edict of Expulsion, 1492, the Inquisition, was commemorated in the spaces as expected of Jewish studies. On the other hand, it was completely disconnected from the fall of Granada, from Al-Andalus, from this kind of expulsion, and there was this separation of the Jew and the Muslim. For many of us, or some of us at least within critical discourse, it was important to connect the Jew and the Muslim. So that's kind of 1492 that was separated, and in earlier essays like Rethinking Jews and Muslims, Staging the Quincentenary, that was one of the elements of the connecting. The other element of connection was, of course, the other 1492, which in the public sphere of the Columbus discovery of Americas, of course, the issue of the expulsion and the fall of Granada was seen as irrelevant to those discussions. So in a conference I co-organized at the time at Cornell called Goodbye Columbus, I actually tried to connect the two issues. And then in my writing, it also meant, how do we think about those two issues, those two 1492s? First of all, there has been some work about the whole material connection, how the treasures dispossessed from the Muslim and the Jews end up subsidizing, as it were, the so-called Columbus discovery of America. But I was interested more in questions of discourses and the traveling of ideas. And the demonology and diabolization of the Jew and the Muslim in the context of Iberia. In this early work, I was arguing travel to the Americas and equipped the conquistadores with the conquista with a former discourse that was already articulated through the conquista. The Reconquista. So the Reconquista prepared the ground for the Conquista in terms of an ideological apparatus about which to speak about indigenous people, the Indians, so-called, and of course about the transatlantic slavery. So that was important for me as a point of beginning in terms of the voyages, as it were, of discourses from one context to another. Now, why Orientalism, at least in one way we can think about it, is the idea that this apparatus, which was about the Orient in Iberia, that is, even if that Orient located to the south in North Africa, the east as a metonymy and metaphor, or the south as metonymy and metaphor, came to haunt and the conceptualization of the Americas. Let's think why. First of all, where did Columbus thought he was traveling, right? So if we think of the Orient, it is bypassing the continental routes that were dominated by the Muslims that Columbus sought to arrive through another route, through the West. So the West and the East were always co-implicated in each other, and his arrival to the West Indies, now we call it the West Indies, and hence, of course, the misnomer Los Indios, the Indians. So why think only of the 19th century, end of the 18th century, 19th century colonization of Middle East and North Africa, and not think about a moment of not simply just conquest, but in which the Limpieza de Sangre and the various discourses about Jews and Muslim, the phobic discourses about Jews and Muslim, come to inform a new space that is of the Americas. So at least just to give the framework of the beginning.
Yeah, that's very, really, really interesting. And I think that part of what is, you introduced another moment in 1992, the moment that you started, of course, the commemoration, but the moment that you started the journey of this kind of trying to recouple and investigate or trace this genealogical quest of the Jew and the Muslim in a way. And I think that something that is coming in the background, and you're writing a lot about it, it's the partition of knowledge and the partition not only of space, of course, of traditions, of languages, of memories, of histories. So in that sense, the partition between, of course, the two 1492s, between the conquest and the expulsion, and of course, the partition between the history of the Muslims and the Jews, that were both of them being expelled from Spain, but their histories are starting to be partitioned in the disciplinary, in the research, in the discursive discussion, and you're dealing with it. You're starting from that kind of point of view, and then by looking, in many ways, one of the narratives will be that there is the demise, the end of the connection of the Jewish-Muslim connection, demise with 1492, with the end of Al-Andalus, that was so-called fertile place for this kind of connections. 1492 is the end, not the beginning. And you see 1492 is a new beginning for something else, that Jews and Muslims, Moorish and Sephardic, are traveling together to the Americas as a notion, as a discursive imagination, and as people as well. And can you say something about that, about this, how this project is going along with your, of course, always conversation with the disciplinary and the partition, situation and discursive situation in vis-a-vis Jews and Muslims. One of your first article was rethinking Jews and Muslims in that sense. Like how you rethink to that moment in that sense.
Thank you. Yeah, this is really important because in general, those of us who believe in not just interdisciplinarity, almost transdisciplinarity, go against the grain of a certain way of doing empirical work within within the tradition of the science of history, as we know, and also within the social sciences of geography. It's not a matter of what's better or not. It's a matter of very different methods of thinking about knowledge and knowledge production. And so I think when you think about metaphors, when you think about discourses, when you think about analogies, or what I prefer to focus on, linked analogies, it's a different way of traveling through knowledge. It allows you a different prism, allows you a different way of thinking about formulating ideas. And again, it can be in dialogue with historians, etc., but it's also a very different approach to thinking about memory, history, identities, and how they are formed and conceived. So in terms of the Americas, while of course the edicts actually first initiated did not allow Jews and Muslims to arrive to the Americas under the control of the Catholic Church because of course the Inquisition. Only conversos or Moriscos, with their hidden identities, actually traveled. Even with Columbus, the translator he took, Luis de Torres, to translate presumably Semitic languages once he arrived to that Orient, was premised on the idea of arriving to a place where that knowledge would be useful, but of course he cannot be Jew, or for that matter, a Muslim. The Inquisition continued, as we know, in all those territories. Moriscos and conversos existed. So that in terms of the actual movement of people into the Americas prior to the post-abolition migration of Jews and Muslims. What happens though, I started delving, having lived in Brazil, having been engaged also with my work with Robert Stem on some of the racial debates and comparative relational framework within multiple spaces. I came across something that even was more kind of fleshed out what I was already formulating in those early 90s ideas of rethinking Jews and Muslim and etc. And staging the quincentenary, and started reading the work of Gilberto Freire, a Brazilian anthropologist who was writing in the 1930s, considered a very crucial anthropologist for the conceptualization of Brazilian identity. And in many ways, it could be understood in relation to generally the formation of Latin American identity. He, by the way, studied at Columbia University with Franz Boas, who was, for the time, we're talking about the 30s, at the time was considered kind of a liberal thinker about race, when the idea of the Black in the context of both Brazil and the US was denigrated. They were giving it a positive reading from a culturalist, not cultural studies, but culturalist, essentialist standpoint at times. And what Gilberto Freire does, especially in mentions and shanties, and I was kind of amazed when I was reading the book and I'm saying, the Orient and the Occident. Well, exactly what I was interested in intuitively, having lived in Brazil. I saw even the traces of that Orient, which he actually talks about, whether the tiles, certain gardens and fountains that are still kind of remains from the early era of the so-called exploration and discovery and settlement. But then I read his work carefully and I saw a kind of an oscillation, how the Sephardi and the Moor are actually almost always together and can be thought of as a Janus-faced figure. There is no Moor without the Sephardi, and there is no Sephardi without the Moor. What is the value? What is the balance? What is the positionality of that Sephardi Moor? Shifts and changes depending on the conjunctural, the conjunctural art of their place in the overall conjuncture of the argument. So vis-a-vis whom they are situated and positioned in the overall argument. So when you speak about modernization, and we're coming back to your series about Sephardi and modernities, in a way, I realize that we cannot speak about Latin America and the discourse of modernization without the Sephardi and the Moor, whether as a negative figure or whether as a positive figure. So, and the discourse oscillates between a certain kind of romanticization of the Moor that and the Sephardi. It is in our blood, our Iberian blood. And what is the positive in the racial context? Unlike those Anglo-Saxons in the north, whose slavery was based on racial rigidity, our slavery was not really slavery. It was kind of a paternal, patriarchal family with a certain kind of flexibility without presumably the racial phobias. And here it goes, almost kind of eroticizing of the Portuguese men, whether with the Indian women, the Black woman, or with the, ultimately, because that Portuguese is also a kind of a Sephardi Moor who's used to conviviality and flexibility. And that actually participates in a horrible discourse of undermining the atrocities of slavery within Brazil. So that was one kind of positioning of the Sephardi Moor. Another one was when modernization arrives in the 19th century, now with the independence of Brazil and the idea of the Brazilian Republic modeled on the French Republic and the North American Republic and in dialogue with them, modernization now is about rejecting that Iberian model, even architecturally, the Haussmann style of wide avenues, no longer the inner courtyards, no longer the shades. In fact, it's kind of unveiling even women who used to kind of veil themselves in the style of Sephardic and Moorish women, no longer expose more their faces, etc. That was considered modernity in contradistinction to that Portuguese Iberian past now evoked by all these elements of the Moorish Sephardic past. So that was in the negative rejection and the modernization. And then there is another dimension to it, and that's the Anglo-Saxon. And the idea, so, you know, if you recall, parts of Brazil, Pernambuco, Recife, were dominated by the Dutch for a certain period. Who came with the Dutch? The Portuguese Jews who settled after the Inquisition escaped to Holland. And in that period of 30 years in Pernambuco, and this is actually Gilberto Freire is from Pernambuco. He now takes a Hegelian, Weberian idea of the Protestant, the Anglo-Saxon, who represent now modernity, productivism in relation to this horrible or the negative stereotype of the Latin, who's now authoritarian and bureaucrat, etc., with a lot of bureaucracy, and that authoritarianism and underdevelopment in the 30s begins to be associated with Iberia as, yes, like those other Moorish history. Let's be like the Anglo-Saxonist, but interestingly, the Sephardi in this context shifts position. Now the Sephardi is part of the Anglo-Saxonist imagination, representing modernity, not the Moorish past, and can be claimed as actually Portuguese. That's really the nationalism of someone like Gilberto Freire, to say, well, yes, they came via the Dutch, etc., but ultimately they're Portuguese. So even the territory of Pernambuco or Recife that used to be dominated by the Dutch, and by the way, as we know, all of those Dutch Portuguese Jews escaped with the Dutch once the Lusophone, one became a Lusophone and under the rule of Portugal, and escaped where? To New Amsterdam. Hence the first synagogue in New York, what was in downtown New York, was a Portuguese synagogue because of this long route into New Amsterdam. So this is a different positionality. And here in that context, de-Orientalizing means getting rid of the Sephardic Moor habits for Occidentalizing oneself, which is now associated with modernity.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that's exactly, you know, the what we can say about how Sephardi, and here Sephardi-Moorish, is a traveling concept. It's a concept that can travel in time and space, changing meanings, getting different kind of relations to vis-a-vis different kind of other identities or other situations. So it can come as a, you know, being expelled from Iberia, but in Brazil it will be representative of Iberia and so on, and until it already in the modernity will be even associated with the Anglo-Saxon model of Protestant identity. I think in many ways, part of what you're trying to do, and this is going back to what we started with the concept that you are, the methodological concept that you are offering in your work, is to do what you called relational analysis or cross-border analysis or diasporic readings that can help us go, you know, avoid monolithical views of one space, one category, one history of here and there, or ours or the others, and really kind to do this kind of voyage, as you did, of the Sephardi-Moorish identity to, you know, to the Atlantic, to America, and in other work, you're working also on Benjamin Disraeli and his concept of the Sephardi. So my question is, you know, you're speaking about, saying you termed the Sephardi-Moorish Atlantic, and for me, it's always bringing me this kind of a borderland, a place of movement. What is this Atlantic? Is exactly the movement of categories of people, of you know, ideas, of power relations, of hierarchies, of racial and ethnicity, and this Atlantic is the place that you want to really show us. And Atlantic is very here, of course, symbolic, because it's not only that Atlantic that you're working on. If you can say something about, you know, about your work vis-a-vis this kind of question of relational analysis, but also the you know, this movement, of ideas and categories.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You know, I mean, this is really, if there is something that I've always been interested in methodologically, is how to undo conceptual borders, boundaries, and once we kind of undo them, what does it allow us to see? What does it allow us to think in different ways than we thought before? And it would be, and I think for you know, having, for many of us, being of the age of nationalism, nation states, and then in terms of our analytical frameworks, I mean, many of us were born already when area studies as a field already existed, preceded us. So those were paradigms that I have often found very difficult to deal with. And not because you know, it's not, there is no value to the scholarly work from which we can learn. So it's more about how we frame that work. And this is really the question. It's not really just about the fact that we gather and they lead us somewhere. So traveling concept really also involve in processes of translation, sometimes literally and sometimes metaphorically, but they also allow us to have the idea of cross-border perspective is to dismantle not only nation-state borders, ethno-national borders, but also regional in terms of how the very formation of area studies was connected to a global domination of the world and how the world was divided. As we know, of course, Greenwich Mean Time is an artificial temporal zone, just as terms such as Near East and Middle East already inscribed in them a particular perspective, near to whom, middle for whom, far for whom, etc. So by shifting the point of view, we can also think about other subjectivities. The notion of, if we think of the Atlantic, so, Al-Andalus and Sepharad do not remain in Al-Andalus Sepharad ossified just in the field of medieval studies, but rather here is a way in which they traveled even apart from the actual exilic and diaspora that ended up more in Morocco and in the Ottoman Empire. Here you don't have massive Sephardi-Moorish, and yet it is an identity that, as I tried to show, constantly an tropical imaginary, tropical Orientalism that is constantly articulated in relation whether to the specter of the Sephardi and the Moor, or in relation to the love or the kind of Orientophilia in relation to the Sephardi Moor. That's also true of Benjamin Disraeli. As we know, often he's studied in the context of proto-Zionism or in the context of, Victorian imperialism. In fact, the epigraph in Edward Said's book is obviously critically mentions Benjamin Disraeli, the East is a career, and that's all relevant and important. But I delved into his novels and also some of his writing. And while there is in Jewish studies a lot of writing about him as a Jew, much less about how he self-conceptualized his Jewishness as a Sephardi. And here is another space of modernity, which is not also connected to Al-Andalus. I cite in one of my work on him, first of all, let's not forget that Daniel Deronda, we tend to forget, it's the idea of the Jew and proto-Zionism, yes, but it's a very specific, I argued, Jew. It's a Sephardic Jew of Ronda, the Ronda, okay? And it's not a coincidence if George Eliot was formulating her idea of the return, the proto-Zionist return, in relation to a Jewish Sephardic figure in England, Benjamin Disraeli. But Benjamin Disraeli himself, I said, well, the other side of Orientalism in its negativity is kind of his self-Orientalization in the positive sense, or Orientophilia, his desire for the Moor, the lost half of the Janus face, shall we say. He goes to Granada, and when someone thinks of him as a Moor during his trip, he's so elated that he would be perceived, that his dark skin, and there is this kind of English romanticism and racialized idea of the Semite or the Oriental or the Sephardi that is articulated, shall we say, in the very famous work of the Arianist work of Renan, right? Because it's exactly turning, they all think in the 19th century in Europe in racialist terms. It's just that Benjamin Disraeli reverses it, and his Sephardi in his novels, whether set in David Alroy in the 12th century, or whether set in the 19th century about the new kind of crusade, it's always about the Jew and the Arab as one figure. He speaks about it in blood kinship. He speaks about it, it's not even cousins, as in the Israeli contemporary Hebrew discourse would be an ironic terms of the cousin. No, he speaks about as one blood. And this kind of, I want to end sort of like with this blood, it brings me again to this paradoxes, because in the Inquisition, we had this limpieza de sangre, which was not just articulate in relation to the Sephardi, but also the conversos and moriscos. We want to cleanse our blood, and even the notion of sangre azul, blue blood, was associated with the upper classes, was the suggestion that the aristocracy was not contaminated like the rest of Spain, the Spanish and the Portuguese, with the Jewish and Arab, Jewish and Moorish blood. And in Latin America, that blood was romanticized, probably not unlike the way that Benjamin Disraeli in England of the 19th century romanticizes. But again, the Jew and the Arab is one Oriental figure turned upside down. Instead of this kind of phobic anti-Semitic discourses, you have the Orientophilia of the Moorish Sephardic figure.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I have so many questions and ideas, and we are approaching the end of our part of the conversation. But I want to end
already.
Yeah, it went so fast and it was so fascinating. So we started with the beginning, and I want to bring another notion that is very much addressed a lot vis-a-vis Sephardi, Mizrahi, Arab, Jewish modern history, is the notion of demise, the end.
Oh,
and you
right.
spoke a lot about the Sephardi-Moorish, as the hyphen that is now seems impossible in the imagination of the Jew and Muslim, the Sephardi-Moorish, and of course your groundbreaking work on the Arab Jew, and your current work on Judeo-Arabic. And I think all of it together is in many ways challenging. It's not only bringing different kind of multiple beginnings, it's challenging the notion or the urgency to find the demise in the scholarship, in the discourse of the Arab Jewish history, current, living together, the history, the discourse, the common discourse, the traditions, the languages. So if you can say something about this kind of, urgency to talk about demise, even, you're working on Judeo-Arabic, on the notion of the language that is going to end, the languages that are in danger, endangered languages,
That's right.
Just to preserve it. The same with the Arab Jew, the same with the Sephardi-Moorish. If you can say something about this kind of things.
Wow. So we're going back to our conversation around Judeo-Arabic a few years ago, right? Yeah. So this project is very much connected because maybe I'm obsessed with hyphens. And hyphens, perhaps just a minor critical point, but hyphens can connect as much as they can separate. So it depends how they are articulated. And therefore, we always have to read it as a marker within a situated utterance. And that utterance would be, we are far away, have traveled in time and space, beyond the Sephardi-Moorish and Benjamin Disraeli, etc., into the landscape of nationalism, ethno-nationalism, pan-Arabism, pan-Judaism, Zionism, etc., where partition, for me, what I was trying to suggest, partition is not just the political reality in the wake of the UN Declaration, etc. That the view, the worldview of partition begins long before the actual partition, and not only with Zionism. It began already prior to Zionism in colonial spaces. That's really sort of like the work around the whitening of the Jew, the Arab Jew already in North Africa, literally even in visual culture vis-a-vis the Muslim, but that Jew remains dark in relation to Europeans in general, including to their co-religionists, the European Jews. Now, this idea of demise, and as though we cannot no longer speak about this hyphen Sephardic Moor, Arab Jew, becomes highly problematic because it's constantly based on demographic statistical idea. How many Jews would really call them today Arab Jews? So perhaps no one today, I do not know. I just know a few of us who would, for one reason or another. It's not historically accurate. No Jew has ever called himself, I'm emphasizing himself, an Arab. Okay, what do we understand by the term Arab? What do we understand by the term Jew? In which historical conjuncture? Does it reflect an ethno-national idea? Does it reflect a cultural identification? And here is the context in which led me, as someone who grew up speaking Arabic at home, a particular dialect of the Jews of Baghdad, to rethink something that became so natural or naturalized, I want to argue, within Jewish spaces, i.e. not within the context of what came to be a notion and a field of study called Jewish languages, and within that Judeo-Arabic as a separate language from Arabic. And this is what I have been arguing against and showing actually in my current work. I'm expanding it and looking into the way that this, in fact, invention of Judeo-Arabic as a separate language from Arabic came as a kind of metonymy and metaphor for the partitioning of the Arab and the Jew. So therefore, if we did not really speak Arabic, but spoke this other language, so-called Judeo-Arabic, and since many Jews who came from Arab countries and the younger generation can rarely speak Arabic, therefore, Judeo-Arabic is a disappearing endangered language that can be part of the UNESCO project of endangered languages. But is it really so? And is it like those Indian Native American languages that we have only 3 people speaking, and there is a struggle in, on Long Island to revive a language that has no relatives in the context? Well, even if my argument was that, well, all the Jews who spoke Arabic spoke it in a particular context, and in relation, there is a commonality and differentiation that coexist in all dialects, and it's not specific to Jews, but rather to the plurality of Arabic itself, even though our dialects need to have particular attention, but they're not, even in liturgical, I actually went to the very books, blessing books, liturgical books that I grew up with, Hanun Nisa, by Chacham Yosef Hayim, Sefer Birkot Shamayim, which is written and says, it is written in our Arabic as according to the minhagim, the traditions and custom of Yehudei Bavel or Baghdad. Arabic, even in those books that were published in Israel in the 50s, 60s, 70s, until the concept of Judeo-Arabic started scaring everyone off of and allowing and permitting and legitimating, as it were, the separation from Arabic, Jews who spoke Arabic spoke about their language as Arabic, and that's what I want to end.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and thank you very much. We did, there's many other questions. I think it's only a short, survey of the ideas that we can take along the, if we have time now in the discussion with the audience, maybe to elaborate more on the diasporic readings and cross-border readings that allow this kind of work, and challenging the very nationalistic or Eurocentric notion of Sephardic modernity as monolithical, and without this option of plurality vis-a-vis identities and hyphen affiliation, and of course languages, as you just showed. Okay, so I'm sadly have to finish this part of the discussion, but we are looking forward now for the discussion with the audience. So Angie.
Yeah, so Amir Al-Khalai, who actually inaugurated our second series last year, has a question, so I think it's only logical that he will be first. So go ahead. Thank you so much, Ella. This was fascinating. Thank you so much. I also have so many questions, but let's hear Amir's question.
Yeah, thank you, Angie. Thank you, Yuval, for doing this. Ella, that was phenomenal. As Ella mentioned, of some of the same generation, we were in the wilderness. And so it's really astonishing to hear the level of relevance for these questions, for how we think about everything, and the level of specificity with these situations, and how enormously how much they impact all kinds of arguments about everything, and so anyways, I just wanted to say that. And I also wanted to say, one of the things about the Inquisition is that it creates, some argue, I'm not sure if that's really the right argument, but it definitely creates a kind of state-sponsored identity, where there's an internal identity and an external identity. And so that, taints this whole period, following the Inquisition. Like, how does one work with that? How does one, of course, one could say that happens maybe earlier in the church in some ways, but in any case, it's a different, I think it's a different it's a different thing. I also just wanted to point out the incredible work that I'm sure you know of Jack Forbes, Africans and Native Americans, where he talks about the drop of blood, law in the US as a way of eliminating Indians, a way of increasing Blacks and eliminating Indians. And that also obviously comes from Spain. So anyways, this was just fantastic. Lots to think about. And thank you. Thank you.
Well, first of all, so great to see you, Amiel. We only know each other 40 years. Hard to think of it this way, right? So really wonderful, and our work dialogues with each other, and it's really, you were on my mind actually when I was speaking of that generation, trying to formulate new ideas around the whole Sephardic Mizrahi thing. So I'm very grateful to have you not only as my colleague but also as my friend for all these years. So thank you for your comment. Yeah, I think the Inquisition is a fascinating idea in terms of state-sponsored identity formation, right? Which a number of authors have talked about, and as perhaps probably one of the first state-sponsored terror called the Inquisition. And I think that your notion of the internal and external is really important, because actually, it's almost like in general, one has, when we speak about relationality, it's not necessarily about positive or negative, it's that all identity formations are ultimately articulated in relation vis-a-vis multiple others. And the process of otherization is always implicit in them. So the construction, the Reconquista with its limpieza de sangre, was all about constructing the enemy other, various enemy others, Jews, Muslims, witches, right? There was a gender dimension to it too. So with regards to Native American studies, Jack Forbes being part of them, absolutely, the One Drop Blood circulated more about, elimination of that identity, because that Native American identity, which was not true of Blacks, because it had to do with land versus labor. And I think that's kind of the discussion. They needed more Blacks for labor, but they needed less Indian in order to dispossess and tackle the land. And by the way, it works kind of similarly in the rest of the Americas. It's not unlike that. But what's interesting for our case is how this the Sephardic and the Moor, before there was even Emma Lazarus writing her poetry as, and always being largely thought as a Jew in general sense, not in terms of her Portuguese lineage. There were those Portuguese Jews in the earlier colonized spaces of Latin America, the Caribbean, etc. But there they participated. I think it oscillated, and that's what I was trying to say. So it's vis-a-vis the Indian. It's a tricky thing, because on the one hand, you can see it even in Brazilian telenovelas that produce over the kind of historical telenovelas. One called A Muralha, which was about a Portuguese Jew converso background, and trying to escape actually from this kind of tormenting Inquisition. And the utopian space in the context of Brazil was called Palmares. And Palmares was a place of slave rebellions, people who freed themselves, went to the mountains, but it also included conversos and moriscos. And that's interesting just to think about the shifting place of rebellions, just as in recent studies it has come to be emphasized much more that Arabs and Jews, Sephardic Jews, were part of the slave trade. So you have this kind of different emphasis in terms of the question of blood and race. Where would the Sephardi and the Moor fit within that narrative of the racial hierarchy of the Americas? I think we're in an ambivalent position.
There are a few questions, but I would like to make two comments. One is that there is another fascinating space of encounter between Spain and Sephardic Jews, and the Sephardi Jew and the Moor, which is the Spanish protectorate in Morocco, in which it's actually the first actual encounter between Spain and flesh and blood Sephardic Jews. And interestingly, the rhetoric, as you very well know, the rhetoric of the Spanish colonial authorities that were, say, part of the Philo-Sephardic movement was that Sephardim had been sent there to Morocco by the Queen, Isabel la Católica, as scouts, basically, to and they were waiting there as seeds, and I'm quoting, for the right time to go back to Morocco, which was part of the future of Spain. So Sephardic Jews were not in the Philo-Sephardic discourse. There was a difference in terms of the blood thing. They did speak about the brotherhood between Moors and Spaniards, but not with Sephardic Jews. They were kin, but they were kin, meaning they were Spaniards, they were compatriots. But I've been looking and I didn't find as explicit reference to how exactly Sephardic Jews were kin, but they were Spaniards, and then Pulido's rhetoric of Spaniards without a homeland and all this. So that is another iteration of this that I wanted to hear what you thought about. That was one question, and another is more methodological. I think that by putting the Sephardi experience at the center, in doing this relational analysis that you call for, we are also presenting the possibility of doing without the question of assimilation, integration, separation that seems to dominate Jewish studies, but also this makes it possible to bring different levels of analysis into historical study. And then we do have to start looking at how, like at the ethnography, and how exactly people use these discourses, how people trace their own origins based on this available discourses, and how they build their identities based on the different origins that are provided to them. So those are just two comments or questions. I don't know.
Well, thank you, Angie. Yeah, those are great questions. I think when I'm, you know, the whole Spanish discourse in relation to Morocco much better than I. But what I would say is that the way, and that's really important for us. That's really the point of relational methodology. That it is a kind of, to use a Bakhtinian term, situated utterance. So the Sephardic identity is never the same, like any identity. It's not only fluid in terms of its own, but it is always articulated in particular contexts, whether we quote unquote, whether it's the subject who articulated or where they're articulated by others. And those are always interacting with each other. I mean, I'm in a way almost beginning with your second question, because what is the boundary? And I think that's why sometimes I end up relying on a certain kind of psychoanalytical language, because I don't believe that necessarily identities are not just what is stamped on your passport or on your official ID card. Identity, as we know, are much more complex than, especially in the era of nation states, would like us to believe. They were always more complicated. I mean, you know, they were always traveling. They were always intersecting, interacting. What is interesting for me within modernity, and especially as it was formed in the Wissenschaft idea of Judaica, is generating particular narratives of origins of Jews, which you know, you can say, oh, well, that's part of Jewish tradition. But this is a scientific discourse that was, for me, formed within 19th century context. So it's not simply about the traditional liturgical of where Ishmael and Israel are from, but it is about the scientific origin that try to suggest that the origins of Jews, the origins of Arabs, etc., are from here or that. That's, you know, I don't want to get into it here, but this is really the whole idea of origins becomes such an important and problematic concept that, to the point that when we speak about Sephardim, etc., we have to speak, oh, Sephardim are only Spain, they're European. I mean, oh, they're unlike the Mustaribun, you know, the Arabized one in the Arabic speaking context of Jews. You know, there is a fixation on fixity, a fixation that we have to have one identity, one belonging, and that's what would be defined us. And that's really what haunts to my mind or affect the way that history or the idea of conceptualizing identity within history writing is so linear, and it's so certain of kind of stable identities. But as we see, you know, first of all, it is how we define ourselves is never completely different, and how we're caught in the projection of others. You know, there is a funny game there between our self-perception and the how we are perceived in the other. It becomes sort of like therefore our identities are always fluid, because our perceptions are also impacted by the various contexts. So if we take the and how identities are used. So in relation to Spain and its attempt to, you know, from a Moroccan point of view, colonize, this is also a shifting discourse, because, you know, I actually, when we speak about the, especially when we speak about Spain and France in relation to North Africa, we also have to remember that it is an interesting discourse, which was not just simply the civilizing mission, which is an important element of the colonizing enlightenment. There is another element that is origins and the idea of return, that the Arabs were truly the colonizers, that actually is, you know, going back to the 7th century, etc., which is a very prominent discourse today, actually. It's fascinating. But even within the era of colonization and the Spanish-Moroccan wars, etc., both, and certainly it was in the case of France and Algeria, the North African Spain was claimed as a return. Why? We come back to the Latins, because we had the Rome dominated that space, and therefore Rome, the Latins were there before Spain and France are Latins. They were there before. So it's a return. It's not a colonization. And that actually played in a kind of a complicated way, not unlike perhaps how Jews with the nationalist movement saw themselves as act of return. And of course, there is a major argument. This is the core of the argument between Israel and Palestine. Is it a return or not, right? So that's where origins, it becomes so important to ethno-nationalist identities. And yet this is precisely, I think, what is at the core of, or the pitfalls of an analysis that is premised on this, you know, idea of origins.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to call Amy Singer to ask her question. And then I have 4 more questions, but I'm going to let Amy ask her question. So
thank you, Angie. And thank you, Ella, for a really provocative presentation. I hope you'll forgive me if I throw another provocation into the mix, which is to ask you how you would continue.
I'm used to it.
That's my sense. So, so how would you continue your exploration of Orientalism in 1492 if we talk about a third, but Mediterranean 1492, and turn to the sort of quote unquote escape of Sephardi Jews and their quote unquote rescue by the Ottoman Muslims, because this 1492 has actually created its own myth truth that was repeated as a truth also and learned by Ashkenazi Jews who then came to the Ottoman sphere. And it was repeated later by Ottomans and especially folded into the rhetoric of Turkish nationalism, both by the Turkish nationalist leadership and by the Turkish Jews as a kind of fundamental aspect of the rhetoric of their identity and their place, their location, their legitimacy, if you will, as part of the Turkish Republic, despite the kind of aggressive Turkification policies of the 20th century and the Varlık Vergisi and a variety of other specific incidents, but then the kind of arc of that history. And this is something that Duygu Atlas has explored in her dissertation about the impact of the founding of the State of Israel on Turkish Jewish identity, both in Turkey and in Israel. And she singles out this quincentenary moment as a kind of touchstone for the leadership of the Jewish community in Turkey and those people who then began to question the myth of the rescue and the blissful existence protected and indeed fostered and encouraged to be part of the Turkish nation. Because that has its own components of Orientalism, of the myth of 1492, which I think can tie in really interesting ways to the dynamics that you were talking about, even though they don't necessarily line up one-to-one. But I think that the discussion that you've built really would help to inform a reconsideration of the Mediterranean 1492 as well. So I'm very curious to hear how you would respond to that.
Ella, can I?
Sorry, yes. Yeah, I think we're going to say the same thing. So we only have around 15 more minutes. So just to, for us to be aware, and there's 3 more questions. So sorry, Yuval.
I wanted to suggest maybe if it's okay, Ella, to collect a few questions. And then
Of course, sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So the next question is by David Toroyo, and he agrees with the interconnection between these 3 events of 1492, expulsion, the conquest of Granada and the Americas, but he adds another one, which is the publication of the first grammar of Spanish by Nebrija, and the role it played in the construction of a Spanish national identity, mainly Catholic, and its role as a unifying element. So he was wondering if you had done any research or if you've worked on the role of language as a unifying element in Iberia, in Spain.
Yeah, and then maybe another question.
Maybe another one, yes. So another one, I will read another one, and then Yoram Meital has another question that he wants to ask by himself. So I will read another question here in the chat by Vanessa Paloma Elbaz. She says, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation. And she'd like to ask you about the relationship of language partition and the claiming of local specificities, such as with Jaquetia, the Moroccan Judo-Spanish, and the Arab of the Jews in Morocco, which she knows most intimately, where the vocabulary and accent were different from that and of the non-Jews. How can we honor that specificity that belongs to a larger cultural entity, but that is separate from certain local manners simultaneously? That's another question. And finally, I collected a question about how can Mizrahi studies and post-colonial studies be useful to de-bifurcate or but bring together and reclaim Jewish and Arab identity.
And from whom this last question? I didn't hear.
This last question is from, I'm sorry, Jaime Belarash. I don't know if I read that correctly. And finally, Yoram Meital wants to ask a question. Yoram, do you want to ask your question?
Well, I just sent you a note saying that Emmy already raised the issue that I wanted to add to this discussion. So allow me to thank so much, Ella, for this thought-provoking review. It was a real pleasure to listen to what you have to say. I just wanted to add that the year 1492 has this Ottoman dimension, not only by or within the Turkish land or the Turkish people, but all over, of course, the Arab periphery of the Ottoman Empire. But this already been raised by Emmy, as one can expected. So I will look forward to whatever you have to add to this. Thank you.
Okay, I wasn't clear, Yoram. First of all, hello, Yoram. Nice to see you. What is your exact question about the periphery of the Ottoman Empire? In what way you're asking about it?
I especially on what you have developed as a construction of identities, and the way that these waves of immigrants coming from the Iberian Peninsula into the Ottoman lands, not only to Anatolia or Istanbul, Izmir, the more Turkish-centric societies, but all over, from Algeria to Iraq.
Okay, thank you. Those are truly thought-provoking questions. So let's begin with the issue of Orientalism, the Mediterranean, 1492, well, I think that field, first of all, the Mediterranean has much more studied in this regard. And of course, we have Amir Al-Khalai with his book that, in a sense, really introduced a different way of thinking about the Mediterranean, which is not limited simply to the medieval era, but and to the expulsion, etc., but also into the very contemporary era, thereby creating an important continuity. So the question is, why would we think about, in what way are we talking about Orientalism? To be honest, I didn't fully understand, Emmy, how you use the concept of Orientalism in this regard as a concept. In what way? I was not completely clear. Is it just because there is a myth or not myth? It's obviously subjected to historical debate whether the Ottoman received or not received. Certainly there was an invitation by the Sultan, but or are you speaking about a construction of within modernity, looking back into 1492 and its role within contemporary? Because I wasn't completely clear about the time frame of your question.
So just to answer you, looking back, so the fact that this becomes then somehow a part of the myth, but it shifts the dynamic of the vertical gradient of power. So it's the Ottomans become the Orientalizers. That is, they have this particular vision of themselves and of the Jews, but it's a strange sort of twist on the whole thing. right?
Okay, I mean, okay, that's a question, how we're using the term Orientalism. I wouldn't necessarily use it for this particular way in which every self-conceptualization is necessarily, but okay, let's assume that we use the idea of, you know, you know, Orientalism in the Ottoman Empire vis-a-vis, it would be probably, we would think about it as the conceptualization of an Orient or an Ottoman space that is articulated in contradistinction to the Iberian space in terms of the fall of Granada, the persecution of Jews and Muslims. Now, within modernity, it comes to serve a whole other function. You know, what is the place of minorities? And there have been quite a bit of work about Turkish modernity, as you know very well, and about the place of minorities within that, whether from the Tanzimat on, and the place of modernity. The question is, what is the space? And I can speak more about the idea of how the Sephardi, the idea of the Sephardi is constructed, and that's connected also to Yoram's question, how it is constructed in relation to Arabic-speaking Jews. What interests me, and we're coming back to the question of language, and I think it still resonates even within Israel and versus Jewish communities, this complicated relationship between those who claim the so-called Arab Oriental. I touched before on the idea of the Mustaribun, but it wasn't necessarily the idea that, you know, of course, sharing a liturgical tradition, but it had to do sometimes with cultural difference, but other times also with continuity. So I'm not sure that you know, should we call convivencia a myth or not? That has been subject that has been, of course, debated. Till today, it is debated. But I think when we say the Ottoman myth, there is a huge difference between idealization of a particular history, the Turkish history and its attitude to its various minorities, and phobic discourses that were already proto-racialized in Iberia. I'd like to draw that difference. So when we say Orientalism, we really speak about not simply a construction of an identity, but rather kind of an ideological function in which whether phobic or romanticist, there makes a distinction. And I'm not sure that I feel comfortable using the term Orientalism, even in what I would say is that there is the Orientalism, de-Orientalizing, perhaps the most relevant to what I was discussing in the context of Brazil and Latin America, is modernity. And with especially Ataturk, one can speak about it as a process of de-Orientalizing, where the Ottoman becomes associated with the old world of the Ottoman, and always also remember Arabic script that had to be eliminated in favor of a Latin script. That kind of modernization process, that was global in many ways, that ideology, and also part of the formation of new ethno-national identities. The idea of where the Jew fits, you know, I really appreciate the work of my colleague Asli Ixis, for example, who, although focusing more on the place of the Greeks, but also in relation to various other minorities, including the Jews, could be thought as the situated utterance of the Jew in relation to the Kurd, or the Jew in relation to the Greek. Those are completely different formations. So yeah, I'm not sure that I would think of the Mediterranean 1492 and the arrival to the Ottoman and Arabic speaking places as in the same way. But I would say that de-Orientalization, similar to Latin America, is a way of occidentalizing oneself, as happened in Brazil. And that part of a general 19th century Eurocentric ideology that is internalized, one could argue, in Muslim spaces as well. With regards to, and that I think, to come back to your question, affects the relationship, and how, for example, even including in Israel, in Israel, in Palestine, in the Ottoman Palestine and British Palestine, something that Yuval's book on Al-Andalus really delved into extremely well, is the self-conceptualization, even by those who are Sephardic Zionists, that were not exactly the same in relation to their understanding of their Arab and Oriental identity. Not all nationalist formation necessarily de-Orientalized oneself in the name of an Occident. One can speak of various forms of Arab nationalism that did model themselves on the Western idea of identity, and others that not. That was part of an ideological debate, as we know. So within Israel, I would say,
I'm sorry to interrupt, Ella.
Yeah.
I just want us to know that we have 5 more minutes only.
Okay. All right. So I'll wrap up and continue with the other questions. Is that the way the Sephardi has been used and abused toward Arabic-speaking Jews to suggest model on this kind of a Eurocentric perception of the Sephardi as European and Ladino, or I would say Espanol, becoming a way by which to serve as a model for the separation, just as Ladino and Yiddish were separating one from German, one from Spanish as Jewish languages. That became the model for Judeo-Arabic and its separation from Arabic. So I will come now to the question of language, because the two questions, one about grammar and the Spanish in terms of national identity, I think that's really fascinating. I don't know that specific context. As what I can say is that in the context of the rejection of the Arab, the Moor and the Sephardi, continued till the 20th century in Iberia in very phobic attitudes, and even the Inquisition was not officially until 68. So we have, but the question of language is very interesting. For example, in the context of Brazil, the Lebanese Brazilian Miguel Nimer wrote in 1943 a book called Influências Orientais na Língua Portuguesa, which was about, he looked into the various influences, and it's, in Spanish and Portuguese, we have residues of Arabic, especially Arabic words. So that's fascinating in itself, but that depends who's using it and for which purpose. There was, as we know, in a lot of nationalist battles, the expulsion of certain words from the lexicon becomes crucial. In Iraq, it's the expulsion of Persian from the lexicon of Iraqi dialect of Arabic. In Spain, that the residues of Arabic and Arab culture was in any form had to be expelled. But in the self-romanticization and the claim for ethnic identity, for example, of Lebanese, or the Turcos misnomer that had to do with the immigration during the Ottoman Empire, there is a claim now, look, we have Arabic residues in Portuguese. This is, we belong here. This is part of our contribution to the melange and syncretism and the mestizaje, which was the official ideology of the mixing in Brazil. Now, coming back to this question about the specificity, how we can claim, the idea that Arabic or sort of so-called Judeo-Arabic or Judeo-Spanish are separate languages suggests that we don't have specificity, I believe is, for me, is really misunderstanding my argument, because it is not about not claiming. Of course, we should claim specificity. That's really crucial for any kind of dialect, lahja, haki, any kind of articulation of the specificity. The problem begins not with the articulation of the specificity, but rather how this specificity is now being framed within a kind of a meta-narrative. What is the meta-narrative? Is this specificity a marker of the plurality and the transformation of dialects and languages, or is it a representative of that we have suddenly an emergence of a new language, I would say, a new concept, not language, but a new concept of a language that now we're told is separate from that other language. And of course, within the Jewish versus Arab space, conceptual space, the impact on that idea of the emergence of Judeo-Arabic as Blau or Blanc or even Goiten for that matter, ended up formulating it as a separate language from Arabic. So the question is, if historically, even in liturgical texts, Arabic speakers, Jewish Arabic speakers may have acknowledged that Hanun an-Nisa is written 1905 in Baghdad, is written in a dialect of the Jews of Baghdad that is mafhum fi Hindustan, that is understood in India because there is an Iraqi Jewish diaspora in India and throughout that region. Of course, he's speaking about a particular dialect, but he's still defining it as Arabic. So the question is, what was the model for separation, if not the Yiddishist movement and its conceptualization, which was, I don't argue against it, one can define a language or a dialect however they wish, but we have to understand this construction without at all negating specificities.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ella. It was a wonderful, wonderful session. We started only to open some of your ideas that we already really encourage everyone to go and read your work. We're looking forward for your next book on Judeo-Arabic. You already published a few articles about it. If somebody wants to read it, really recommended. And thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you so much.
We're so happy that you came. Your work was in this kind of series for the previous 2 years. Everybody, either was in conversation or mentioned. So definitely, it's a wonderful beginning of the 2023.
Thank you both, Angie and Yuval. This was a wonderful pleasure. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. And
I'm sorry we didn't get to, there were people that kept texting that they wanted to ask a question. So you certainly raised a lot of interest.
Yeah, I would be happy to get those questions if possible.
I will, I will collect them and I will send them to you.
This is really, really helpful. Thank you all really, truly for your questions, whether we're in agreement or not. It's a wonderful conversation to have. And I thank you again, Yuval and Angie.
Yeah,
I just want to let you all know.
Yeah, we're going to meet next time.
Yes, exactly. Next time, March 14th with Yoram Beital.
Yeah, March 14th?
March 14th. Yeah.
Okay, so we're looking forward to Yoram's talk next time.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.